Hello. Maybe I should turn off my music.
Hello.
How are you?
Come here.
Hello, Peter.
Good morning.
Morning, morning.
Hello, hello.
Hello. So I'm not sure who's coming today. I guess we'll wait a minute. Suffice to say, from my end, the meeting with NISO, the conference went very well. I'll give you a few more details, and then I've had some discussions with Vint and other people about where to go. And here's Adam. I think for this particular aspect of the call, Fabian and Adam, with all respect to you, Peter, and everyone else, are the most pertinent. So I think I'll just start because it's recorded anyway. And this is a little bit in the response to Adam's very honest and positive tweet, saying what he is or isn't interested in. So if we can spend the first 5 minutes on that to clarify. I'm going to try to make this, thank you. I'm going to try to make this even more of a dialogue and research effort. I think we've had a good month to waffle about on structure. So in summary, I think the structure is the journal will be invisible except for as a resource. If anyone in the team wants to contribute an article like I do, very welcome to do so. We're also going to invite more people externally to contribute to the articles, and they automatically, external ones, not necessarily ours, we will decide that ourselves, will become part of the volume 3 of the Future of Text. The website has been scaled back because of people's identities and what they want public. That's fine. So Future of Text is a little bit of a scream, because I like to do that, but it's also got a few links on it. So it makes it easy to share each other's work. You just put it there, you're in VR headset, you click and you go through. And yeah, so the article that most of you have read, the one that I've written for ACM, that's the one where I'm saying two things. VR has to be better for work. Information in VR is not automatically accessible. And visual meta is one of the approaches of that. And what we're doing in this lab is doing, of course, we're not all visual meta, but it is one of the things we're looking at. So what I plan to do now with VintSurf's assistance is try to get some money, initially primarily to hire programmers to do the boring stuff so you guys can do the exciting stuff, and then see how that goes. Any comments on that? So update from the NISO thing was very, very interesting. I had two sessions there, one that I was a panelist and the one after that where I wasn't. They were both at 2:30 in the morning. So first one I was okay, second one I actually felt drunk at the end of it. I'm not 16 doing an all-nighter anymore. But in the presentation that VintSurf and I did to NISO, by the way, NISO is the American National Institute Standards Organization, so it's a pretty big deal. I talked about visual meta because that's what Vint is supporting me with. He's there all the time for that. But as I've spent a couple of weeks persuading Vint, the metaverse will need open metadata access. So he has agreed that it's okay for me to scream about the metaverse and visual meta too. He was a bit skeptical to begin with, and that's fine. What I learned at the conference, or rather relearned, is that metadata and documents are messy. No surprise, but it was interesting to hear it again and again. And what was really nice was the session I went in the middle of the night the next night on semantic document structures and things like that. Actually, twice visual meta was brought up by other speakers, partly as I wish it could be like this. I think it also was implied that our solution is a bit naive, but at least it's something that they see as being positive. I also have one meeting with an academic next week from this environment, and I've been in one email dialogue with another one who says this is all very beautiful and simple, but it's outside of what they do. And finally, somebody involved in American records for government is excited about this, and I hope to get something useful there. Because if they make it clear officially that they would love to import documents with this, that would be good for us. Hi, Brandel. A few seconds recap. Number one, we're going to try to keep Monday and Friday meetings for dialogue and demos. The journal is going to be kind of a record of that. If anyone wants to contribute articles, they're welcome to. The NISO meeting went really well, and it's starting some good dialogue, including into the metaverse, meta and the metaverse. So there we go. That's my report. How's everyone else?
Pretty good. Pretty good.
The link that I sent you to the journal, which will only be public next week when we have the next speaker on Monday in it, now has a new section at the end that has a few links to books and resources and whatever. That's just something that I will be scraping from whatever conversations we have to, to put something in. If somebody feels I missed something, please do tell. We'll have to talk to Alan about how this will fit with the newsletter that he's working on. But I thought it was worth mentioning, even though you think you know the newsletter, there's a new bit at the end of it. One of the new bits is about Google's efforts in the metaverse. And Vint has been very, very positive this week about supportive. So when the piece that you all may have read that I wrote sent today, we're going to share that with Tim Berners-Lee and try to get his perspective on what we're doing. And then I'm going to go out to try to get some money, partly for coding of boring things, and then whatever we can do as a group to further what we do. Yes, Peter.
Okay, I wanted to report that I'm nearing completion of a set of widgets using IMBA to handle the user interface for my website, and I'll certainly share that with our group website. It will have a set of options so that you can have accordions, you can have single selection, multiple selection, tab panels, single selection tabs, or multiple overlaid tabs so that we can have more than one layer, like in a GIS system where you'd want to have multiple things on in the same physical space getting composited together. And I'm refactoring all of the code using some new features that IMBA introduced only recently. Once it's all done, I'm going to try to start combining that work with the code that Adam sent me using Three.js for desktop VR. And then it's a question of how desktop VR would play with the headsets. I think Three.js said that they can create a button that would automatically move the Three.js web VR into the headset world for people who have headsets. So that would let us use the IMBA user interface affordances in the broader VR world without my having to be dealing in headset land myself.
That's wonderful, Peter. And I look forward to seeing a paragraph or write-up or whatever, so we can put it in the journal. But please also buy a headset. The project will pay for it because it literally cannot be described. You literally have to do it literally. And seeing it in a square screen is so far removed. You really deserve that experience. And the amount of effort you put into this, I think it's absolutely right that the project can send you one. So I will keep bugging you by email if you don't do it. And then I'll have to find an investigator to find out where you live to just send you one. 2D and 3D are not the same.
They're not, yeah, monoscopic and stereoscopic, and having a fixed vantage point similar to what you see with a monitor versus head tracked. I mean, there are ways of simulating aspects of that. One thing that was very, very interesting was is using head tracked stuff. So if you use a webcam and then make use of the eye tracking, for example, to move the stuff around, then that is pretty interesting, but you still don't get the stereoscopic cues that come from it. If you're flat out not willing to use an Oculus Meta system yet, as far as I'm aware, it is still necessary to use create a Facebook account. They have said that they're going to drop that requirement. If you have a Windows machine, then you will have the ability to use an OpenXR thing with access to that. So you can use what's called a Windows mixed reality headset. Fabian may be aware of Linux alternatives, but I'm not aware of any way of connecting a Mac at this point to a headset.
Yeah, I'll just briefly, if you know, I don't have a Facebook account, and I think I briefly also chat with Adam about this. If you get a second-hand Quest 1, and I think if you can have an Oculus only account, still owned by Meta as a company, but hopefully they're not. I'm not a lawyer, but they should not be up to a certain point blending all the data together from the two companies. Maybe it's one, so that might be a way. And otherwise, of course, so yes, for Linux, actually, it's what I wanted to share. So it's another how do you say? It's another order of magnitude in terms of price, but then you have the Valve Index, which is made by a company that sells stuff. So in terms of course, it depends from your value system, but they're not selling advertisements. So they were just trying to sell video games and to sell hardware, and they support Linux. And then I'll share my screen. The one thing that is annoying is this. You have the cable. So you need a good computer. And indeed, as Brendel said, you need an operating system which is supported, which is either Windows or Linux. As far as I know, Mac is not an option. But I want to briefly share my screen on this specifically, just for a minute. Can you see my screen?
Fabian, absolutely no rush. So please take your time sharing.
Yeah, okay. I'll slow down. This is a demo I tried, I made 2 years ago, more or less. So it's running the index on Linux, and then I have a couple of different windows because it's running Pixlr Desktop, which is an open source window manager. So the windows you see on your operating system, to move them around, it is supported in VR. So you can move them around, the windows themselves. And what's also interesting is you can have on top of this a VR application running, not just, let's say, the operating system, but that's in the background a WebXR application so that you can paint and still have the windows of your desktop there. And because they're from your desktop, if you want to put a PDF, you can do that. If you want to grab images from that PDF, you can do that. You can move your controller as a pointer. And it's something I wanted to show this because also we had discussion last week or Monday about how to pull content from the screen. That would definitely be a high resolution, high quality way, but requires a setup like this. It's not standalone. You need an actual Linux desktop with a powerful graphic card to do this. But that's definitely an option to have and rather quickly window manipulation and their content in the headset. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And just, sorry, we're typing a bit in the chat here. So not everything you guys do is web-based. So if we're all going to share each other's work, we would need Oculus for everything. But some of it we can share by using web-based VR, right?
So yes, I haven't shown you any non-web-based stuff. And for the most part, when you're if you're not doing things in web, then you're typically still using say OpenXR or whatever, and everything in Unity tends to be OpenXR as well. So they aren't particularly opinionated. You have to build compile targets, so those might be specific. But if people have code, then for the most part, nobody's targeting things that are specific enough at this point to one platform because people haven't differentiated their platforms. So Index may give you hand tracking, but no other headset other than Quest will give you. Oh, that's not right. Maybe the Vario XR3 will, but that is also a $10,000 headset. So not necessarily your sort of appropriate for your first one.
So another thing I wanted to mention was, so I'm here in Bergen, Norway this week, and we went to an exploratorium science thing for my son. It was all very nice, quiet because COVID restrictions have just been lifted. So they had this bike on a wheel for a centrifugal thing. So I went on that and I was able to cycle completely 360 degrees 5 times in a row. And the reason I'm saying it, Peter, is I didn't feel queasy at all, because even though my body was the gravity was being faked because of the centrifugal force, I could see everything as a human meant that I knew what was happening. So I didn't feel queasy, but I still feel queasy when I move in VR if my body isn't moving. If I'm walking, no problem. But if I sit down and pretend I'm in a plane or walking, I get queasy. So I think that's what you experience. So I think most of what we're all building here in VR is either sit down or stand up or walk about a little bit. None of it is get in a vehicle and fly around, because the magical thing of the Bob Horn mural was not, and this is really bizarre actually, was not that you walk up to it, you pull it towards you. And I wonder if there's something really deep there, because visually it's the same thing, obviously, but because you're using your hand, your body and brain, and particularly stomach, isn't fooled into getting sick. So these are the kind of things we can only learn by being in the space, because before you are there, it's very theoretical. Anyway, we will arrange for something for that, Peter, and I'll have to mute you for the rest of the discussion if you try to argue against that.
Do you have a PC, Peter?
I have a MacBook Pro.
Yeah,
And
Right. Well, it's not.
I do have Parallels, so I can run Windows underneath it. I don't know whether that's good enough, because I have Windows and Linux both running in Parallels machines.
So there is a third solution. I don't know if I mentioned it the first meeting or not, but there is Cloud XR by NVIDIA, which does the rendering in the server. And I actually tried it, and even for Valve Alex, which is a zombie game, so you definitely don't want to be laggy, but it's super demanding in terms of graphics, and that worked pretty well. It's a bit of a finicky setup, but it means you can also have a full-on desktop experience on a standalone headset, assuming you do have a good connection. So that doesn't prevent, let's say, from this kind of experience, even with standalone. It's feasible.
Well, we were just talking about the imperative of actually being able to inspect and interact with these environments in actual sort of head-mounted display virtual reality.
That's a funny sentence you were about to say there, Brandel. In real VR, in real virtual reality. Yeah, just briefly to catch you up, Bob, the NISO conference was very good this week. And we're going to keep these Monday, Friday meetings being about interactive text, especially in VR, and demos in terms of how we'll organize ourselves, do the journal, and also how to look for a bit of funding. We will do separately, maybe on Wednesdays. So today is all about that. And we were just doing, just like what Brandel was saying, telling Peter, got to get an Oculus. So that he has been fully convinced. And now maybe we need to convince you or not.
Yes. One of these days, I've got a lot on my plate right now, but maybe in a few months I can do that.
I have a visual argument to try to convince you.
Oh, will there be screen sharing?
Yes.
Screen sharing is going to happen, everyone.
Very exciting.
So let me try to convince you visually. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I mean, I'm in my space, let's say, and then I'll pull up some data you might hopefully recognize, which was the poster you shared a couple of days ago.
Mhm.
My offset is not perfect, but you can manipulate and put it back. And I sliced it on what seemed like meaningful sections.
Yeah, good.
And then you can, of course, the idea would be to be in the space. And ideally, I didn't explore the inside of the PDF, but this I manually sliced, which is why it's a little bit off. But I think there are zones basically in the poster that would allow to do this. This is semi-automatic, let's say, because it can be, of course, any poster with whatever dimension. And then, of course, you can put whatever size you want so that if you bring more people in, it's really the right size. And that's still, again, in hubs. And I think the quality of the text also is still pretty good.
Yes, very good.
But yes, has to be tried with a machine, and as also Brendel said, or I think no, you were saying, Fudge, with being able to put it in or around, but being able to make the more tangible, let's say, connection with the content.
Excellent. This is really inspiring me. There are, for one thing, Froda, when I looked at the mural that he's showing right now, the vision of visual language for the next few years, I realized that what you inspired me was to see what a table of contents of such a mural would look like. And then, of course, how to make a visual metadata of a mural like that. So that's what I'm now thinking about. Haven't made a lot of progress on it, but maybe I'll be able to report in the next week or two.
That would be great. Thank you, Bob. One of the items in the journal that I put in at the end, one of the resources, I came across a series of links for design, as in traditional visual design in the metaverse. And so I included a link to one on how a new generation of architects are just having fun and making proper environments in VR, but not with any physical constraints, obviously. So I think from our perspective, it's mostly a diversion, but it may also help free our thinking a little bit. It's kind of nice that it's being looked at as well.
Those articles were also fun because they talked about zoning laws or zoning regulations for VR. In real life, it may be how tall a building is, or if you destroy the views for your neighbor. But in VR, it can be about the weight of the site if you're in the same world, how big the images are basically, and the models are, so it loads quickly for everyone and it's not choppy and so on. So you will have different regulations for VR if you want to stay in the same world. It's very interesting to see those social problems or playing together in the same environment.
There's an architecture sort of personality thinker called Andrea Ion Kokojaru, and she's an architect who's got a lot of stuff to say about what virtual reality should learn from architecture in terms of the design of space for different people and purposes and roles, which is really interesting. And similarly, I don't know that he's made the jump into thinking about it in the context specifically of virtual reality, but a fellow called David Kirsch, who's I believe psychologist at UCSD, has a great series of lectures. I may have mentioned them before, but thinking with the body and other things, and that's specifically to do with embodied cognition. That the idea that having heads and bodies and hands and ultimately hopefully also feet and legs is essential for a lot of the way that we do our thinking. It's not this kind of Cartesian model of just sort of cogitating in a dark room of the skull. It's an active engagement with those things. And so those are the very useful reference points, because he also talks about the way that architects think with objects and dancers in some really interesting and somewhat quantitative detail. So really good sort of reference points. I'll dig up some useful links. So that's Andrea's Twitter account, but I can find just one of the more specific talks that she's made to things like the University of Washington Reality Lab, because they're really interesting in the context of what architecture means and what we need to pull on because of what we already know of designing spaces in other contexts.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
I also put on that, to be honest, that's one of my motivation for VR. And that's also why initially, motivation for VR as a medium in order to manipulate information and text. Because yes, our body basically is pretty smart. And I think our memory, I'm always blown away with a memorization of paths. When you go from a A to B, like I can tell how to get to the bathroom of a friend that I haven't seen for 10 years. This is just like, to me, that's mind-blowing. I cannot maybe remember what they were, but somehow how to navigate through their place, I found that incredible. And to be honest, that's also my hypothesis for the usage of VR for manipulating abstract content, is that the location and how you navigate through makes sense. Which is also why, so I put a link on a call for paper for an architecture publication for UCL, I think, in 2 weeks. And they are trying to see also links between VR and architecture and how one can learn from the other. And that's also where I wanted to come back also, Froj, to the point about if we have a headset like this, either sitting or standing, or if we can move around. Honestly, ideally, if we can move around, I think it's better. I think if you can have an empty 10 by 10 room and move, of course, it's tricky to have, but it's the best, or even 50 by 50 or whatever, but it's the best condition, let's say, for quality VR. Sitting, not so much, just standing, but not being able to walk, it's not as good. So I would also argue for really physically moving in the room with the content.
Yeah, I mean, one of the exciting things, of course, is how you can map, not only set up a guardian area, but also map things in the environment. So you make them virtual objects as well. So right now, of course, with Oculus, you can do a desk and a sofa. You can't do a chair, but it's coming along. So, when you move about a bit, depending on the environment, the table is the table. Even that makes such a huge difference. So it's going to be very interesting to see how physical architecture will change to accommodate virtual architecture for exactly the reason you're talking about. Maybe we'll have different kinds of shelving systems and different ways of systems can get out of the way. It'll be absolutely fascinating. And of course, having Bob in the room and thinking about what do we do with the wall space? Initially, you can just put up murals in every wall if you want, but then what? How do you change into another one and find the old one? Do we go back to rolls like we had at the Library of Alexandria, or do we have other methods? And of course we will, but it'll be wonderful. Peter.
I wonder if we'll have a new era of end user architecture. Right now, it's a highly licensed profession because you have to make sure that physical buildings don't go collapsing. But I see no reason why, if we got into a modular system where you could grab predefined components, snap them together, restructure them, the computer couldn't go and run all the structural analysis automatically, and you could sort of cut out the middleman, at least up until you get to final design stages where you're actually thinking about building a real physical building. But certainly for all the conceptual level work, you should be able to have the computer tell you, okay, no, you've cantilevered out too much, this thing will rip out of the ground and kill everyone. So you'd know that that's a bad design. but it could really like alter how we perceive what needs to be regulated as far as the profession goes and where those boundaries are going to go between people using augmentation assistance to move into the currently dominated by profession space and what's going to remain the province of people who've gone through rigorous certification and licensing standards.
Right. Well, certainly in the context of where people are designing architecture for makespace, I think there's a sort of ample opportunity for people to do architecture that remains within a virtual and a digital space as well. But to both ends, it's true. There's active work being done at all of the fancy places that do that kind of stuff. So Autodesk and Trimble. Trimble's a company that makes a product called SketchUp. They bought it from Google. They make BIM software in general, so building information management. A friend of mine built their computational geometry core. The idea of being able to make a meta configurator in the sense that you can configure a system that allows you to configure parameters for a range of, say, chairs or windows or stick frame wood plans and things like that. And so that's definitely happening. But I'm also interested in what architecture for its own sake in a virtual context does. But yeah, to that end of how spaces change, I think it's worthwhile remembering how much spaces already have changed. That Mark Anderson linked that Scoble piece that asserted that sitting in VR is the best for the present moment. And while I think that's true, I think that says less than it sounds, because we will have the necessity and the opportunity to change spaces for the benefit of this. One of the things that I like that is sort of less popularized within the Doug's demo is when he talks about his partnership with furniture companies, with a furniture company to design the lap system that he had in order to get office furniture that was appropriate for those spaces. And we have to remember that the office has been transformed several times in the past century. Herman Miller, yes, of course. As has the kitchen, as has many intentional spaces, encoded spaces for the benefit of accommodating the modalities that are most amenable to them. So, the intense time and motion studies that totally refigured the shape of the kitchen in the 20th century. The shape of the living room has changed as a consequence of various constraints related to televisions, and they can and they will change again. So yes.
I mean, it makes me a little bit scared, but in a fun way, because once we had the desktop publishing revolution, those were some pretty awful desktop published documents. And so if we now have the home architecture revolution, we'll have some pretty awful houses. Having done a full build here and a complete renovation in London, I can tell you that, of course, having an engineer present is important, but the architect's basic experience is so important. Yes, you may want to have a thing there, but he's built 100 houses before, or she. So therefore, you will be explained that maybe if these rooms go together in a different way, it may work better. So I look forward to having better access to have an amazingly talented architect consult on your own build, rather than just doing it all by yourself. And maybe we can have similar situations within the VR environments themselves, not just the physical ones on the outside. Fabienne and then Adam.
Yeah, I'll briefly show the camera just to see at a very small scale that's happening. So that's a screenshot that I took 10 seconds ago. Can you guess what it is?
Is it a 3D printer?
Yes, so that's the 3D printer in my basement. And this is, I design, it's completely silly, but this was just 2 days ago. I have a little timer in my kitchen, and the nose of the penguin was broken, which broke my heart a little bit. And I spent honestly 3 minutes redesigning a new nose, sending it from my desktop. Then I went down to also get some clean clothes and the penguin nose, so I can't stick it on. And it's not as large scale, of course, as Furniture's proper. I really wish it was, but for now it's gadgety side. But in a way, it's to me that's mind blowing also to imagine that I couldn't conceive that like 5-10 years ago. And now I can conceive an object, but not like a VR object, a physical, tangible object. And it's funny that it's the same, of course, with the naivety of I'm not an architect, I'm not a designer. Whatever I do is breaks but it forces me actually to have the same sense of control, like how do you print, what is going to be, how is it going to resist, the kind of materials and all that. And what the failure I have on this specific project for the 3D printer is my hope was to design the headset and pick it up after the session. But the time scale is completely different. The headset takes seconds or minutes to do, and the printers is like hours for something minuscule. But I do hope and think at some point they're going to converge. And you can see also a lot, I don't have an example here, but a lot of people that print for VR, like the better straps or better things to hang and everything. So different time scale, but still some ways to customize, but indeed requiring a ton of expertise that is not necessarily for everyone. But then also you have simulations, you have other tools to facilitate the steps of design.
So this week I've been thinking about the mural, the discussion of the mural, and what that would, if we take it digital fully, in 3D and hypertextual and interactive. Yeah, the different aspects. One, what should you do? Where is a good limit so it's accessible through different mediums? If it's a full VR experience, it's hard to look at the flat screen, for example, it could be, and so where are the good lines to draw? But also what it could be, if that mural behind Bob there would be a 3D thing, and it ties back to having architects or professional designers that is professionally made, that most people won't be able to do such a nice diagram. You need lots of experience how to place things and find good proportions, and so I think we will get a new kind of a typographer or a graphical designer that works in 3 dimensions with knowledge objects, not just aesthetical objects or social spaces, but also knowledge objects. And how would you go into, for example, with argumentation maps or timelines is a bit easier because it has a more of a fixed direction, so it's easier to visualize. Of course, it has many properties, but for an argumentation map or a big diagram of some sort where you need to follow something complex, how would you go into? Would it be a tunnel you go into with backing material behind things, or how could you lay out an argument map in 3 dimensions and have it? And also, if you open supporting material, like hypertextual material, things that are not shown from the beginning, but that could be interesting if you are interested, if you click or interact with something. Where should it go? Should it go in the front, or should it move to the side? Or where could you put those things, or how would you interact with it? There are, of course, 1,000 ways to do it, but what are the good ways, or what are interesting ways to explore for that kind of mixed hypertextual content and argumentation map that has kind of complex flows, but in different directions? Yeah, over.
Wonderful questions, Peter. Unless someone has a specific response to Adam, of course, then obviously jump in.
I do too. Yeah.
Go. You were first, Bob.
I think one of the things that we can do is experiment with some of the maps that and the murals that we have, and I'm hoping that some of the folks in this group will be interested in doing that. I have sketches here right in front of me in my notebook of how to take apart and rearrange something like the mural behind me, and what maybe we will be inventing some of the new functions that will be a command that show me the history, for example, or just show me what the key decisions are, or I don't even know what those functions will be, but they will come together with some of these different kinds of murals, as Adam said. You know, I've worked a huge amount on argumentation mapping. You know, I built the earliest one with 800 moves in the argument. We can experiment with that, and it also has to do with the early history. It arranges the early history of the arguments about whether computers can think or not.
Bob, so what's your experience with? I've read about some argumentation mapping software, and they some of them are quite interactive, where you can follow a line of argument and open things up and close things up. How does that play with our sense of location and the fixed kind of the fixed mural, where you really get to know the material by place? The thing Fabian talked about, that you. Yeah.
Human beings need some of the fixedness when they're dealing with complex thinking and complex arguments, for example. We can't have what's his name? I forgot I used to have lunch with him all the time in London when I would go over there. Took all of the moves in the 800 moves in the argumentation map that we made on Turing, and put them in a much more flexible way. But I found it harder to trace through. But it was a worthy experiment. We need these kinds of detailed, worthy experiments with different structuring, and I'm hoping to be able to do some of that with some of the people in this group, with the systems that you're already making. They're really quite amazing.
Are you thinking about Simon Buckingham-Shum, maybe?
No, he was at Open University, but you know, yeah, I had contact with him, and I lectured at Open for him back in the, well, I don't know, the early 2000s probably, or the 1990s. He's now in Australia, by the way.
Yeah.
And also it has some thoughts, although I don't know what he's doing with three-dimensional thinking. One of the other experiments that I've learned about, relevant to what we talked about, well, a few days ago, is that I have a friend who spends a lot of time in Second Life, and it turns out there are lots of libraries.
Oh yes, yeah, I remember you mentioned, Bob. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And so now I'm curious. I haven't gotten back to her yet, but I wonder if there are geographers in Second Life. It's a huge space. Has anybody made maps of it? Because it is a large, complex space and three-dimensional. And how are those maps made? Are they made three-dimensionally in any way? I mean, those are the kinds of experiments that may already have been done that I don't need to do, for example.
So I want to come back on the 2 points that Bob and Adam raised because there's one word that sticks to me instantly. It's layout. Either you have something that's simple enough, like one item, and you don't need to have a layout algorithm, you just put it there, that's it. Or it's complex enough that you need to find one way. Let's say, Adam, you mentioned like a tube or something like this. You also mentioned, Freud, that we could have roles that unfold on our walls. And so to me, that's the tension we have, is we have something, a digital medium, so it's complete freedom. You can update it every millisecond. And on the opposite end, you will have, okay, it's not stone carving, but it's still, you're not going to print a mural of 10 meters every 5 seconds. So you have that tension between the two medium, printed versus digital. And the additional tension to me is And that's what we mentioned, let's say, about the body intelligence a couple of minutes ago, is we can be in VR. Our body and mind are in VR, and then we start to move around and move objects and whatnot. And when you don't have any stability, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with the graph layout, where you see all the graph moving at once and using like physics-based simulation. So the little nodes of the graph are going to just move in every direction until the graph is stable enough to optimize, for example, for space. And then the graph stops moving, it's stable. And that looks very sexy, but in practice, if you have to be in that graph, physically move around, it's completely fucked up. So you basically have to resolve the tension of something that can be moved. If you have an argument map and a new argument shows up, how can you optimize for that map to be stable enough to still account for the novelty, but not change all the time? Because change all the time, again, if you want to leverage the memory, that so good memory of going through paths that we have, it has to be stable enough. So that's, in my opinion, one of the biggest design constraints we have with building for an abstract topic, however you want to represent it, but with enough stability.
Very good points. Excellent points.
Yeah, thanks, Fabienne. I have so much to say too, but Peter's been so patient.
Okay, I posted a link in the sidebar to a Doug Engelbart mural showing his life's works done out as a long timeline. So I don't know if you've ever seen that before, but it's a nice little gem. I just wish we could find a copy with a little bit higher resolution. When you try to zoom in on some of the small print, it starts to break up and pixelate because it didn't capture
have a video of it
with quite enough fidelity. But very fascinating.
Yeah,
yeah. Clegg presented that at the Future of Text in 2016. I'm just saying that from a Wikipedia article, but it means that it's been before this community, before Freud's community before.
Yes.
And also, I remember a very interesting game interface back in like, must have been early 1980s. But it was some sort of a driving racing game. And the visual metaphor was running through tubes that had subtunnels branching off on sides. And that could map very nicely if you were trying to visualize some sort of a data flow structure and you were interested in looking at it from the perspective of a datum moving through that structure. And there might have been some work a while back that sort of echoed that in the software visualization area, but I can't for the life of me remember the project, but I just have a vague reminiscence of something. Oh, that reminds me of a video game I saw in the 80s. Wouldn't it be nice if they could have better replicated that interface for what they were doing now?
Yeah.
Yes, to that end, there's a data visualization architect at Apple, used to be at Mozilla. Perhaps you know him, Fabian, actually, Ali Al-Masawi. And he did some really, really wonderful things for our information security group, where he showed all of the IP packets between all of the virtual network connections over a 24-hour period in order to assess what might be fraudulent information and the kinds of patterns that emerge from being able to have meaningful spatial arrangements like that, but also to see the transitions between things rather than static visualizations was really quite wonderful. I'll have to talk to him a little bit more about virtual reality and the opportunities afforded by it. He's no longer an InfoSec, but he's at Siri, so it still remains relevant, I think.
Randall, yeah, that sounds absolutely perfect. I was just thinking, one of the pieces I put at the end of the new journal is about, I think Mark Anderson also tweeted about it, was you play chess against an AR system and you have physical pieces, your opponent doesn't. But it scans your physical pieces, so it has a full picture of the whole board, and you can see how the opposing system moves just through overlaid video. So there are so many opportunities that comes into your thing, your headset, reading the environment, right? So I could easily imagine you use your normal printer to print out key things, and you put it on the wall, move it as ever you want when you have your headset on. And the headset is aware of every single thing you put on the wall. So you can then do extra things with connections and all kinds of good stuff. So you take your headset off, you still have that artifact on the wall. But when you put it on, you have all these extra levels of activity. So similarly, I could imagine we start having something associated with our phone, for instance, because that's an item we usually carry with us, where when you take your phone out and you put your VR on, it has all kinds of sprouting bits or anything else we have, even maybe clothing or different rooms, so that it reads the environment more usefully and you can leave artifacts more usefully. There are so many opportunities there. I mean, imagine even using paintings in your own home. You have a painting of a ship. Okay, let's have fun with that. We can do a lot of interesting things with that ship. Where's it going? What's the history of the ship, et cetera, et cetera. And I could go on forever. Fabienne, please take over.
Yeah, so Brandon showed us last time the small video projector he has, and that he was looking for a step motor for it. And I was thinking the alternative is a robotic arm. And ideally, if you have this spinning fast enough, then you project back in 360 so that whatever you modified in VR is going to be displayed back in the wall at the end of the session. So ideally, a set of video projectors. In practice, still, it's something honestly that I think to do with, and I'm using the word again. What was it last time that you have to flatten it, and it's a trace, and it's good to capture some of it as an invitation back. They're also laser video projectors, so it consumes a bit less, I believe. But yeah, definitely to have some kind of permanence despite having left the medium.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that I've been really excited by is the idea that you can have a continuum of representation, so that an HMD is a very high fidelity array of lights that you have the ability to configure. A projector is.
Sorry, did you say HMV? Oh, head-mounted vision. What?
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, HMD. And I put a video up to interview for a job actually. Of what this looks like when you have it sort of moving around. I'll put the link in because it's too bright in here to see it at the moment. But with a brighter projector, it would work better. But another thing that I realized is that I think I've said before that just LED arrays as relatively coarse displays can still code for things. And so you can have representations in your space simply by scattering LEDs around. In fact, they don't even need to be structured as you put them on, as long as you have a mechanism for identifying the spatial relationship between them, particularly from different vantage points. So you can just throw a coil of LEDs into a room, and then by virtue of being able to observe it, turn it into a configurable dynamic display that can show things on it. But what that means is that while you were saying, Fabienne, that we don't have the ability to print out things at 5 times a second, what we can do is use lights to encode meaning that we have previous familiarity with, and then we do have the ability to configure those quickly. And so having that whole continuum of fidelity for being able to represent and remind us of certain sort of artifacts, roles, and positions means that we can create a space that has persistent encoded meaning that we can kind of refer to with the levels of fidelity that we require at any given time, delving back into an HMD or projective stuff as it becomes necessary, but remembering and knowing that it means what it means through more coarse mechanisms for signaling those things that nevertheless remain dynamic. That's.
I think we shouldn't forget that regular screens are doing quite good 3D as well. It's easy to jump between flatland 2D PDFs or documents directly to the head-mounted display and not affording the screens the 3D regular 3D. So I think it's very good if we do a kind of a mural in 3D and VR AR, that it's viewable on a regular screen in 3D, because we should really remember that hundreds of millions of kids every day, and older people as well, Frode, are playing 3D computer games with high fidelity, wonderful graphics, and really enjoy those environments. But we haven't got so many information environments to really try out there. So we don't know the limits of having flat screen 3D, pushing the limits of a flat screen 3D. So I think the baseline, I think, should be 3D on the screen that is jumping out, because it's harder to do that flat to 3D conversion, we are really losing a dimension. I think it's easier to have 3D on the screen and then have all the wonderful peripheral vision and hands and all the affordances of AR, VR added to that.
I'm not quite sure what your idea is. I can't quite visualize that. Are you saying starting with, first of all, in a VR environment, starting with three-dimensional representations of knowledge, let's say, that it might be extremely useful to be able to flatten them? Was that what you're saying?
No, I'm flatten as in display it on a regular screen, but I really mean that it's 3D, so you have some way of going in that, like a regular 3D game.
Yeah.
And then there you go around, even if it's on a flat screen, people play 3D games all the time. And so, I mean, having the exactly same 3D representation, which you fly around in and walk around in. And my experiences from playing with large amounts of text the last few weeks, and finally I've got my VR debugging setup going, thank you everyone, is that I still prefer 2D for most things when I'm navigating large amounts of things, because the display resolution is there and the motion sickness is not there. So and people play 3D games for long hours, and I have also logged a few hundred or so thousand hours before in it, and without ever getting motion sick. But in VR, I got motion sickness immediately, or VR sickness. So there are strengths to the regular flat screen, doing 3D on a regular TV or flat screen. And it could be TVs or big monitors. I don't think they will disappear immediately, maybe in the long term, but not the next 15 years or so.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a big part of what I'm writing in my Blue Skies paper, absolutely. I mean, my thinking now is that information is inherently multidimensional. So a metaverse type thing is a natural aspect, but yes, it is absolutely crucial that we should be able to take the slice that we want out of this for different kinds of use. But also 3D and in 3D and 2D are completely different experiences. One key thing coming from this older gamer that you mentioned, Adam, is when I do my run around and shoot 'em up in the evenings every once in a while, I'm interacting with things at a distance. To interact with something nearby is actually really complicated, because I kind of have to go, I can jump up and down, and if I'm doing long movement, no problem. But if I have a knowledge thing in front of me, it's just messy. So that's the positives and negatives for the different environments. But also on the point of, so this is what I wrote in my Blue Skies. You haven't all read the paper I sent today, right? Okay, so one really important point is, in the physical world, you can print something out, go into someone's office and wave around the document and say all kinds of things. You can underline it, show it to people. You can fold it into a paper airplane if you want to. But in a virtual environment, you can only do with that document what that room allows you to do. And that's really important. If you go into a room and you have this document that doesn't have annotation abilities, you can't write anything on that document. It's not possible. So the portability of data is really, really important. And that's one of the things that I keep bulldozing on the whole visual meta thing. Because you also, when you're in a virtual environment and you have a computer screen, as far as the virtual environment is concerned, that computer screen is just a texture. It could be someone's clothing. It doesn't know and it doesn't care. So we really, to be able to allow so many of these things to happen, we really need to look at mechanisms to move things around. Because one of the things that is so exciting with the mural thing is it has time. It has an XY axis that is time. So that means that it can be used for so many different things. I would absolutely love to have a wall in my office dedicated to time murals, where if I'm working seriously, I can have something that Bob has there. If my son comes in, just like you were saying, Adam, I can show history of dinosaurs on there. but it'll always be left to right, same place, overlay, whatever stuff that I have available. But we need to work together to find out, how do we define time in this environment? You know, what are the actual standards? And how do we define layering and categorization? How do we save a view from this? Not just technically, but user interface wise too. You know, imagine Edgar has, you know, for instance, he learns that the difference between the Stegosaurus and the Tyrannosaurus Rex is actually longer than the difference between the T-Rex and us. You know, he goes, oh, wow, right? How do I frame that and put it somewhere? You know, what are the elements that I take with me then and not? And ideally, I want to be able to put this into a flat space so he can have a piece of paper, bring it to his teacher or something on his laptop and say, look, I've learned this and that. And the teacher can take it back onto the school wall. So that, I think that really goes to the heart of some of our non-commercial efforts, because as I said a million times, all the companies want to own everything. We're trying to make sure that can happen. As in, we're trying to really make a new web here.
Yeah,
Well,
and I wanted, sorry, I wanted us to get the dates extraction that Adam has up in front of Bob. I don't think you've seen it, Bob, but
No.
do you have it available, Adam, or do you want me to show it?
Yeah, I think.
It'll feature it's in the journal, Bob. Did I send you a link today?
Yeah, but I
No.
I didn't get up early enough to read it.
That's fine, but it is one of the articles there. It's really cool. I hope Adam can show it.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm really excited about it is, so he's taken there's a PDF up online that is the thing that I extracted the image from, Bob, of your mural. What he's done is taken the PDF content and actually identified the 4-digit date numbers, and then extracted those and put those off at 90 degrees, so that there's additional sort of things that you can see from a glancing angle. I mean, one issue is obviously that because the mural was never designed for additional dimensionality, it's perhaps a redundancy, but I think it clearly indicates that if there were additional pieces of information that were layered into the document, explicitly, visually, a visual meta way, but that were for the deployment and display within a richer environment, then you'd have the opportunity to create progressive disclosure of showing what it works for in 2D, but then have a system that is more nuanced, able to rehydrate that with more positional sort of dimensional data. So I'm not sure if you can follow that link, but
I just noticed I have a resolution bug in it, so it only works on high resolution screen or high retina screens. Does it completely fill the screen for you, or is it just 1/4? On my other computer was 1/4. Brendel, could you show it?
It looks great here, by the way.
Yeah, but you're probably on a retina something or someone.
Yeah. I'll. It didn't load the dates this time. So I'll.
I beat
you've got it.
I beat you.
All right.
So, yeah.
Is it in the right place as well?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. I will say something after.
No, you speak.
Sure.
I'm just moving around to illustrate
Yeah,
what you're talking about.
I just extracted the actual, because there are some different times, so I matched all the times I could find in the text. Not the 1980s or so, but specific times, specific years. So not the decades, but specific years until, not in the far future, but all 1900, 2000 years I matched here. And just put them 90 degrees out, so in this way. Of course, you could put them on the floor or in the air, together with some text if you like to, but it's just a way of bringing one type of information out there. But look at the signs here. If you rotate here, the actual text is to the right side from both angles. So there are many things we have to consider when we do labels here. I had to do double labels, so they are transparent, but now the ears read left to right, and if you rotate, the actual thing rotates invisibly at the. There are small things we have to consider when we do things like this, because text in 3D has many. It always has a backside, and how do we handle that backside? It's really an interesting problem.
It's bloody marvelous, to put it in British.
Wonderful.
Yeah, just a small detail for you nerds here. But we have to consider all those things when we put fixed labels. But of course, this is not perfect. There are dates that appear in places that were never intended to have something, I guess. 1954 is, so hidden metadata is brought forward here, and also
I might say that you're working off a JPEG on this case, I think.
No, it's a PDF, but it's PDF. Not. It's rendered, so it's not super sharp. We have to do additional things to get it extra sharp. But okay. It is.
I want to say that all of the murals that I've made in the last 20 years, about 60 or so of them, of comparable detail, and many of the most important subjects in the world. At least to many people, are done in Illustrator. So any object in any of the murals can be, could be taken out and at least made as a kind of demonstration of what's possible. Because then we can, for example, each one of the little newspaper headline things which I use, each one of those can be an object, and one can pull those out easily and change them. Even each one of them is changeable in Illustrator. So and I offer any and all of the 20 or the 60 or so murals that I've made, plus their background stuff to this group to experiment with any way you want to, and I'm happy to provide. If providing the Illustrator parts of it are useful to you, happy to do that as well.
Cool. And Bob, this is the kind of 3D that I was talking about. Here you have a 3D representation. You don't have a flat object because the text is rotated out in 3D. So this is a 3D scene, but on a regular flat screen. We all look at it at a flat screen. So there is I really think we should preserve the 3D-ness on flat screens, have that as the baseline for virtual things. So we could, worst case, show it on a screen or on a projector or in other forms.
It's not the worst case, Adam. I agree.
Or one case. Sorry,
yeah,
one case.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I wouldn't.
That reminds me. Sorry. Go ahead.
It would be very interesting to see the dates that you have extracted, not done perpendicular to the mural, but just pulled out on another plane, and see what lines connect them. Because if that would be a function that might be quite important in mural in timeline making over the longer run.
When you say lines connect them, in what sense? Just chronologically, or
yeah, just chronologically, because I see, for example, two 2001 date, or there are multiple dates that are the same, right? Or could be, and so one begins then to ask, well, okay, what does that mean? Well, what is the meaning of different chunks of information with the same date on them in different places on the mural? Looking at my own mural, I can't answer that question, but it intrigues me. Do you see that 2001, right where you're showing it right now?
Yep.
1, 2, 3, 3 different 2001 dates that I can see on the screen right now. How are they connected? What's going on there? And they're in different places of the mural. That's what some sort of lines that connect those, perhaps. I don't know. I don't know. I'm just speculating.
Yeah. We should try 100 things.
Have any of you, I'm not going off topic, even though it sounds like it, seen the Netflix series Snowpiercer?
I saw the film. I haven't seen the series.
Okay. There's a TV series now called Snowpiercer. It's about global cooling, 1,000 car train going around the world. It has a perpetual engine. If it slows down too much, people will freeze to death. It's pathetically silly sci-fi, but it's really, really engaging. But the reason I mention it is in the beginning intro, we see the train tracks. Obviously, there's not just one track, but we see a red drawing on the globe. That's easy. We see that in the main person's office space, but also in 2 different environments, they have done it with strings like a murder wall. So they have a little index card for the key points, and it's just string strung around anywhere they want. So I'm wondering if maybe we need to start looking at not only the environment reading what a thing is, but also doing something like QR codes. Because I can imagine if things are coded, you can have that string either physically or virtual, and you can start moving things around. And I could even imagine having something downloaded to my Apple Watch. And if I then go into the wallet, let me see if I can actually do it. Yeah, QR code on the wallet. That can be seen by the environment at some point. I'm pretty sure Apple will probably do that, for one. How amazing would it be to draw it out of your watch, right? Or whatever it might be. Just lots of different ways to get away from the thinking, not that we are in the thinking, of a static demo of one single mural, but doing exactly what Bob is talking about is what are the mural components we can build?
Yeah, I would also like to submit, I can share the screen for it, but there's a really wonderful video made by, sure, okay. So I'll load it up and then I'll share screen. So this is a video by, I'm not sure if anybody's heard of John Boyce. He is the lead, he's a creative director at a place called Super Bowl Nation. So this is about sports, not something that is particularly dear to my heart, but nevertheless, pretty interesting. It's a video called The Bob Emergency. And it's a case study of athletes named Bob over time. But the thing that Boyce does is build a sort of a large, persistent, 3-dimensional data sculpture of all of this kind of tracks of information about a thing. So he's done stuff about the wins and losses of various teams, but this is an entire object that sort of represents the entirety of his story. And you can see here that he kind of rotates around it and talks about the number of bobs in years, and then this object has a shadow that is being cast as a consequence of its height, and then he turns in the shadow, he turns it into this section of all of the different leagues and organizations that are the bobs reside within, and then creates little components whose visual area is proportionate and related to their specific events. So this person is I guess a boxer, and these are their things, and then he'll probably show the boxer's wins and losses and the thing. So one of the things that's very interesting about it is that it's making use of a very large and arbitrary scale kind of things, so this is talking about the history of the term battle royale and the sort of the racist origins of those for those who are playing battle royale in the sort of the modern day. But yeah, being able to pull back and then recontextualize all of these bobs, all of their sporting achievements and their relationship to fame and whatever sort of circumstances. So it's fascinating. I mean, probably the more fascinating if you actually like sports, but really amazing as a sort of a case study. I think I've reached out to him before about the possibility of trying to put some of these things in virtual reality as it is, but he hasn't replied. But I think as an exemplar of what spatial information might be when somebody really cares about something as much as this fellow obviously cares about sports. I think it's really interesting. So yeah, definitely give it a watch. It's an hour and a half, so it's the sort of thing that it's an entertaining watch, but it's a long one. But really, really interesting in terms of the breadth and the scope of the sort of the visual techniques that Boyce has developed for being able to do this. And I think really, really provocative in terms of what might that mean once you actually get it into virtual reality too.
Wow.
This is clearly fantastic, but a very specific thing from yesterday's NISO meeting was one discussion of what is metadata and what is data. Of course, Ted Nelson famously says there's only data. But in a thing like this, if this was to be done live, what I expect we would need is a mechanism to say is lift this data and put it in this form. Right? So how do we put that into a CSV or a spreadsheet or whatever? Has to be some part of the magic, right? Because if you can't extract it into whatever this neutral format is, of course it will be wrong, it'll be imperfect. But considering all of you with so much experience, if you were to do that, to take one, let's say from a map view to a graph view, how would you do it now?
Whoa.
It's a thing we do all the time when we program in a way, whenever we have a document, or when I put all the dates from the PDF on the side, I extract things. They are not as organized in a table there, the dates. It's not so structured, but it's still data that I put there and render. And sometimes it's destructive rendering that I don't attach the actual data to the visual object or its representation. And a PDF is a kind of that also. It's a rendering of a manuscript that is a bit destructive on the way, and many things are like that. But I guess not what you're asking for, but I really think we should attach more data to the objects we put in the representations, so the data stays there. That has many real benefits, because we can do things very locally, and we can take an object and just extract that object without pulling the whole data source with it. Sometimes we need to do that as well, but
absolutely. But the thing is, the problem with Fabian, Adam, and Brandel is that actually also you, Peter, just in a slightly different domain, you know too much, right? You can always pull into some kind of environment, write stuff around, change some of the things, and then put it somewhere else. Most end users can't do that, either because they're not smart enough like me, or there's a mental block. So maybe we need something like a data palette. I misspelled it there, I'm sure, but when you paint, you have all your paints here. Maybe we should have something that gives you basically a spreadsheet, which looks like a spreadsheet with as few controls as possible. And all you can do is make sure that the X and Y axis at least is correct. So, it's like a really strong visual, like you would, if we have Bob's mural and you say, I want to copy from this, and then it may copy everything. But when you paste, you may want to specify what aspect you're pasting. And if you're going to do that live, there has to be a method whereby you can specify which things you want to paste, right?
Yes. Yeah, it would be very interesting to take a mural and list the and just make lists of the verbal elements in it. Now, all of the chunks of information that I generally do are divided into headlines that are boldface in some way and others. So one could extract all the boldface ones, list them in some sort of fashion. It would be imperfect, but all indexes of all books are imperfect. having had to make a few of them myself and supervise some others, but they're useful. They're nevertheless, very useful. So that kind of an extraction function would be very helpful to people.
Yeah, some sort of a way of letting the end user, while doing things with gestures is absolutely magical, also have access to quote unquote under the hood type stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned spreadsheet. I think that's the basic metaphor that should be followed. I'm not sure if you're familiar with. There's a researcher, Felina Hermans, and she says that the biggest group of programmers in the world is Excel users, because there are maybe 50 million, which sounds like a lot, but it's not, people who are sort of nominally software engineers or programmers in some sense. There's closer to a billion, maybe 1.5 billion people who have used Office and Excel, and some of the things, and without joking, like people have been able to implement things like neural network backpropagation and incredibly elaborate algorithms, sometimes unwittingly. A lot of the time it's software engineers showing off, but you can implement incredibly elaborate sort of functions and systems for managing and manipulating data within something like Excel. And so, as I've been sort of working on what is information in VR, I'm also conscious that what is Excel in VR is just as important. And I think that the sort of the meaning of the information needs some kind of representation that's more related to being able to layer in that multivariate stuff in maybe tabular form, but having that representation, that flexibility of representation, that view specs component of it is essential.
And also one tool that I really miss for end users is equivalent of Microsoft Access. The very light database that you put your recipes in. I mean, not everything goes well into a spreadsheet, like 2 dimensions. Sometimes you need a bit more, objects of objects. You want a few pictures, ingredients, and so thing. It could be HyperCard, but HyperCard and Microsoft Access are 2 things that we have dropped along the way that I think could really have a comeback today. Now it's usually pushed into a web service somewhere. People do web services, but we could have something very, very light that is personal and sendable, more like a document than an online database as well.
I'll briefly show you something. It's a bit of a joke, but
Fabian,
yeah,
you're not allowed to say briefly again. Take the time you need.
I'll take. It's going to take too long. You'll see. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
So it's Excel in VR, because indeed the metaphor, or not the metaphor, the biggest, the most programmers, like my better half is not a programmer, but she can use Excel and she can start to combine information, and it's reactive. It has actually some pretty good programming principles, but not Excel, let's say spreadsheets in general. That being said, that didn't really become popular. So there is something there that might be interesting, maybe as a transition and maybe as a way to help. And yet in practice, it's, yes, I'm not so sure. And so that was the joke part. The slightly more serious part is, for me, that's not interesting. The part of, and that's why I do prototyping for a living, and that's what gets me going, is to be, and it's going to sound a bit grandiose, but nobody has been before in terms of thinking, in terms of tools to think. I don't get excited, and it's going, I don't want to sound elitist, but I don't get excited for popularity. It's really because it's new, because it allows me to see further, that I'm going to put tremendous effort into something. And there are people that are much better at user experience and design and making sure onboarding is excellent so that anybody comes and it becomes intuitive. That's definitely not me. So it's a little bit of a, I don't know, goal or culture clash there, in the sense that I know that the success or the popularity of the tool is going to link to how easy it's going to be for a random person. But I'm not that random person, and I don't want to be, because yeah, I invested also a lot of time and resources in learning programming and learning different stacks and programming language and whatnot. And it's to be able to do not whatever I want, but whatever I invested more to go further, basically. So it just wanted to highlight that.
That's phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal on so many levels. Bob Frankston is someone I know well, not very well, I was trying to say. He's in the book, First Future of Tech. Wonderful guy, I have met him. He is the co-creator of VisiCalc. Maybe worth talking to him to go back to sort of one of the early systems to see if there's any lessons that we have gone down funny routes. But also, just to emphasize, I think today's chat is absolutely wonderful. I'm sure you all agree. But also, my mission, I mean, look at Meta. They spend 10 billion a year on VR. You know, I'm sure Apple is spending a good amount of money too, and Google, etc. You know, we're spending our time, and you know, we're in a way competing with them because we're competing for attention, right? So if we're going to do that, I think one of our absolutely unique focuses has to be, of course, novel interactions, because we can think without having a senior manager above us telling us what to do, which is incredibly valuable, but also the thing of how to move the information about. You know, the spreadsheet in VR that you just showed us, to be able to take that, to take something from a Bob Horn mural and put it in that spreadsheet through an interaction and a technical system, and then spit it out somewhere else, and then maybe combine it with some wiki data. This is the kind of magic that is not a demo. So that was just wonderful to see.
Yes.
Your hand is raised, please.
Yes, it's to show something. It's not going to be very visual, but I'm rather convinced you're going to appreciate. And I don't know how I can share it. So that was the other. On Monday, I was showing the text extraction from visual meta of a couple of properties, let's say. But what was missing was to be able to, for example, if I put them back, but I'm not going to do this because I moved on to other things, but that still works, was to be able to save back, and ideally to the file itself, in the PDF itself, despite some of the risks that we mentioned about maybe the conversion, you lose some data, etc. But that's the result where, so that's, let me go back.
Please zoom in.
So that's the document that you know. But then if I go at the very bottom, and if I zoom quite a bit more, so you can see also some of the presentation is gone, but I believe it's still not up to spec, let's say, but readable by a human and still by a machine. And maybe more interestingly is here, I added also some of my own content, which is as silly as it can get, but just a proof, let's say, that I've added it. But one has to imagine, instead of this test here, a position in space, for example, or rotation or some property, the result of being manipulated in VR. So I had a couple of technical challenge, let's say, in terms of servers and security and whatnot, but it's pretty much there. But yeah, so it's modifying the original PDF with some assumption. Like I just assume that, for example, all the visual meta fits in one page, which is the last page. I imagine that's correct up to a point, but maybe not all the way. If people have 20 pages of data, don't know if it's a good idea, to be honest. But not impossible. So that's one way to basically manipulate in that VR environment and server side save it back to the former original file, let's say.
No surprise that I think that's absolutely fantastically amazing. You shouldn't have to, of course, if you're starting with a normal visual meta document, you shouldn't have to rewrite the basics. You should only do an additional appendix. It is Fabian Special 3D World, something like that. But now I get to a question that is very close to Adam's way of thinking, I expect, which is seeing all these things. How can we have a thing that knows what it is? What kind of knowledge object can we have in this thing we're talking about? Right? It is so crucial because, you know, since the 90s, I've been fighting against information ghettos, which is what CD-ROMs were. Right? And now we're moving into this environment that is completely, fully enveloping us. So obviously, today with on the Mac using author and reader, copy from reader and paste to author, you're copying the selected text plus the entire visual meta. So that's how when you paste it, it is a known smart unit or whatever it might be. What might the equivalent be in the world we're talking about now? And finally, an addendum to that question is, or an addition is, should all of this be possible in VR initially? Or do we maybe need to do some of it in VR, go out into flatland to do some of this data stuff, and then go back if we're going between environments? Love to hear what you guys have to say about that.
I'll just jump in for the last point. We don't have to do everything in VR. Most of the stuff I don't do in VR, and that's perfectly fine. And again, I go back to the same, the remarkable part, it's never going to be good enough in VR, and that's fine. So combining, I think, is more interesting, let's say, through different either tools or processes. And I'm going to show just that to answer that question, to illustrate it. This is a bit also what I've done this afternoon, which is I have hubs again on the left that I was showing for a lot of the demo. And on the right, it's a 2D, 3D VR painting tool on the web. And it saves the data on the server. And in hubs, I can refresh and see the modified outcome. So it's two different websites that don't know each other, don't care for each other, but they have one GLB file format that they understand. And then they can communicate. And also it's here for recording could be in 3D or behind my screen, but in VR the same. So it definitely doesn't have to be through the same way to interact as long as they communicate.
Thank you very much. Bob?
Yes. And your question, as I understand it, is how do we have a thing that knows what it is? And we have to look at, I think, the question a little bit more. How is anything know what it is? Well, it knows it's alive and knows its context is one possible, maybe limited, but at least one possible answer to that question. So my general answer is contexts. And what do we mean by context? Well, that's a whole question of how to represent relevant contexts to the thing. Because one has to limit them. Otherwise, context is infinite, and hence not all that useful, because we become, just overwhelmed by trying to figure it out. I'm told, I haven't read him, but Arthur North Whitehead, philosopher of the first half of the 20th century, used to say that any one thing is connected to everything, and one has to be able to specify that. And I don't, I think that that's an overwhelming kind of thing. But I would suggest that there are maybe a limited number of mappings that could be visualized in murals or other kinds of knowledge maps that would give useful, many useful structures, maybe more useful structures than even any individual might use at any one time. I'll stop there.
I think that's a really important sort of point, Bob, about, like, I definitely take Whitehead's point that things are sort of irreducibly connected if you're talking about something in an essential sense. But I'm also reminded I think he's a statistician, George Box, and he says all models are wrong, but some are useful. And yep. From that, I take, by that I understand to mean that every time you make a representation of something, it's opportunistic and it's intentional toward a specific end. And so to that end, only the features of it that matter for the specific mode of analysis and the intents are relevant components. And that's one of the things that people struggle with when they hear about things like racism in MP3 format. But the fact is that the MP3 does a specific, the reference materials for encoding certain frequency ranges were biased toward arias, which are a very specific kind of musical performance, and they were worse at other things. And so there are biases baked into the format. That doesn't mean that the format is racist, but it means that it's prioritized toward a specific thing. And the same goes for photographic contents. Certainly, people familiar with the Shirley cards and the concept of the color curves as they went through beige skin versus darker skin is aware that there is not only is it possible for a medium to be biased, but it's almost inevitable to be biased towards something and against something else. And so, that's not to say that we need to reinvent those formats to be more inclusive. I mean, it wouldn't hurt. But what it means is what we're doing with stuff depends on what we mean to do. And so what we represent inside a virtual space, inside an information mapping relation, doesn't need to invent the universe. The sort of the initial refrain for a poorly supervised honors or master's student is to have to define every single term under the sun as part of their thesis, and it's not necessary because you're in a discipline and you're in a domain, and so I agree. We don't need to do everything. We just need to think about what are the things that matters. But we do have an opportunity to be more holistic with it. We have an opportunity to be more inclusive, and that's where I'm really excited by the idea that your murals, Bob, could have things that are just absurdly too small to read if they were at a fixed scale. But given that we opportunity to potentially scale those things up, much in the same way that John Boyce's Bob Emergency sort of data sculptures work, that we have the opportunity and the ability to inspect them, and that's not just in a kind of a finicky, like, well, technically the information's there, but actually we have a real opportunity to be able to inspect it. So yeah.
Well, the contexts of this mural, which is nuclear. The name of the mural is Nuclear Waste in the United Kingdom in 2000, but still now. The possible contexts are many. For example, it doesn't say anything about the context of nuclear wastes around the world. And that could be a mural. There's an agency in Australia that keeps track of all the nuclear waste kinds of things and nuclear plants that are being made and are running. So that that would their organization and what they know is a possibility of a mapping and of a context. The same thing as drilling down into it. There are places in the UK where the nuclear waste actually is, and the towns nearby know that the nuclear waste is there, and so forth. As similarly, there's context for different disciplines. I mean, part of what I was engaged to represent was that the agency in charge of nuclear waste in the UK had different researchers who were geologists, who were radiologists, who were chemists, who were even social scientists, all having to do with their context of the nuclear waste. So but this is not an infinite number of things for practical purposes, but one wanted to integrate all of their, as many of their perspectives as possible. So that's why we did this. That's just an example of if there was a list of these, that would begin to answer Frode's question, which is then the mural would begin to know what it is, right? And a list is just the beginning, you know. You have to maybe represent the list in different ways and so forth, at different levels of detail and whatever.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. Fabian?
Yeah, it's to actually echo the initial remark and Brendel's comment on top, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with Donald D. Hoffman, so a professor of cognitive science in Irvine. And he wrote a book called The Case Against Reality, basically saying there is no such thing as reality. And he gave a couple of examples and some, which I find particularly interesting, just some evolutionary simulation where you run some organisms against another as abstraction. And basically the ones that survive are not the ones that have an absolute perfect view of the world, but rather something usable. Because if you want, for example, if you look at the wall and you see all the different shades of white and you can't look away because it's so interesting, you just need more information, you're going to starve to death. So you just need to have a good enough representation of that white wall. It's a white wall, I don't want to bump into it. There is no grizzly or food or whatever. I move on from it. And I think I find this perspective of being pragmatic, basically, yeah, I don't know if it's correct. Mathematically, it looks like it. It makes sense to me, but it's basically whatever is useful for the goal, whatever is useful for that context.
You're going to give me a headache shaking my head when you say things like that. Absolutely. I mean, this is why when research was done on trying to create kind of a color chart of smells, of scents, you know, like if you have a molecule that's like this, you change it like this, and it's going to become more and more like charcoal or whatever it might be. It turned out it couldn't be done because the human olfactory system isn't gradual based like vision and hearing. It is, we smell things that were good for us and bad for us. So there are thousands and thousands, and of course combinations, but you can't smoothly go. So yes, and this is also in the blue skies thing. In here, there's neuron stuff going on. And with VR, we're going to start reconfiguring this as well as that, absolutely. And that which is useful is what's going to happen. And seeing Edgar growing up is so exciting because the concept of affordances is, you know, that thing over there is a chair. That's the key thing. It's not the fact that it's blue. Right, those are aspects, and the whole thing of non-objectivity for human perception is going to be coming into so much. And of course, I know I'm speaking to the choir. Absolutely, it was just wonderful to hear that. But to the point, going back a little bit, is with the time stuff, because I've seen, you know, you guys have worked on different aspects, but if we can start on the interfaces for this to generalize, it would be really, really wonderful. You know, XY is easy to keep for time, for most of the time, obviously. But if we then build layers on top of this, so one layer can be arbitrarily history of America, whatever, you know, use Wikidata. And then on top of that, we can put Bob Horn's data from an entire mural, but it happens to be on the same page. And then we can pinch in to go into details to go out. If we can manage to get even that completely smooth and have the data be able to move about, then for instance, our own data, we've had 100 of these, over 100 of these meetings, and Brandel has already done visualization on some of the text. Imagine if we can take all the transcripts for all our meetings and do different analysis, which will then be color coded and in shapes moving in and out. And then we turn, you know what I mean? You know what I mean? I'm just going through saying, I want to see this for real. I want for us to propose standards because, you know, who else is going to do it? Others are going to do it for their own things. We need to do it in the open way.
But then, Frode, we need to narrow down a bit. What is that useful for? What do you learn from that, or what do you gain from seeing all our conversations? So we must have something, a value that is pushed forward through seeing it, not just the value of doing things.
So I'm going to use you against yourself and in agreement with yourself, because we can't talk about these things forever. And we also need to test, but we also need to know what we're doing. So I think what we're getting at in these different things is really good tests and also good issues of plumbing, while also looking at what's useful. My mother-in-law, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, she taught me one incredibly important thing. I had built a globe on the iPad and iPhone, which had no information at all. It was just terrain. The key was you touch something and it'll then draw the outline of the country or the body of water that you're in, write the name. And if you zoom in enough, you could see the city, and getting city data border was actually really difficult. But the key thing is, even though I developed this and I was very proud, I'm a son-in-law, she didn't care about any of that. She immediately went to the place in Japan where she came from. And she wanted to show her village. So that's why I've been hammering on about real data. So I think that if we do a little bit of plumbing for this, and then we can actually start doing trying to find out the useful cases, because if we have access, if we have an XY, and if I can say to you, I want this stuff as time data, and you guys help define how that should be formatted, I can start putting in things and saying, oh my gosh, I didn't know that Peter and me had an overlap in Syracuse, or whatever it might be. I think we have to go back and forth between use case and implementation and infrastructure. Infrastructure has to be there. I'm not arguing against a single point you said. I think you agree with all of that, Adam.
And I don't think it's your thing to come up with that as well. It's just it's mine as well. And I have the sense that, of course, timelines contain useful things. I think we need to articulate those things, because that will inform the whole representation and interaction with it. And it's sometimes hard to start the other way, to just throw data, find the usefulness, and then do a different thing. We can work that way, but it would be nice to have a bit more, if we come up with something, a useful thing to actually, not just serendipity that we were born on the same.
Well,
date.
I see you have your hand up, Fabian, but just to get the little thing in there. The way that I'm looking at it now, my personal interest is documents with visual meta and timelines. Of course, there's an overlap, but you know those are like two kinds of projects, right? And when it comes to a document, I'm shocked, and you were there, the first time I could read in VR. It's actually pretty good. It's not bad at all. You know, when you have it in front of you and it's all the right focus, it's actually completely readable. I want to be able to take some of our documents in and start playing around with them. And then I can start finding out my pain points and my opportunities, because lying in bed with my eyes closed and dreaming is really good, but very limiting. So if we just start with our own reading, and I think one of our user groups is kind of academics, you know, students doing research, right? So that's why getting those kinds of documents in. But the timeline, I think in the beginning, we need to be broader and more open, because that will allow us to get to the use cases to find out. So let's say we start with just Wikipedia or Wikidata, you know, zoom in and out, and then we can play with visualizations. And let's say we agree, not necessarily today, but in a future session, that we layer certain things up and down on the y-axis, and then we choose to have the z-axis for this and that. I don't know. But that kind of thing in dialogue, and then we play with it. We realize this, and maybe that's the axis for connections. Maybe lines go there or something. Sorry, I went on and on there. Fabienne and then Bob.
Yeah. So first of all, if we talk about, let's say, generally handling data, even spatially, there is something called the grammar of graphics. We don't need to reinvent how data is going to be laid out or specialized or whatnot. There is like really, and it's still ongoing research, so it's pretty active. But I think to tie it back basically to, we discussed for the last 15 minutes with 10 about being useful, having an interface that is useful, being able to, having a difficulty projecting how it's going to be used without a goal. And that seems to be natural. And we seem to all agree on this. And I'm going to sound a bit harsh, but I don't play with visual meta to please someone, and I don't tinker with the poster to please someone else. It's because they exist. They are not perfect, no offense, but they exist, and that allows me to have a ground to play with, tinker with, and also be challenged. And I think that's, I would follow something similar, like being able to run a workshop or whatever you want to call it, and ideally that not one of us, but someone else would use the tool with that data to achieve a goal. That would be a proper evaluation of whatever work we can put out. Otherwise, I do enjoy, how do you say, philosophical discussions, but I think they only go up to a point. So running somehow a workshop with ideally someone else, and based on the data structure or the metadata or the interface we can come up with, and with a goal, I think would be a lot more productive and useful for the building anything really.
I think you're actually reflecting on what Adam has said earlier about, in different aspects of this conversation. I think that's very good, but you said something different from what we've thought about, in that you're talking about someone presenting rather than someone learning. We've been very much about thinking and learning, but in terms of a demo, maybe what would make sense is if we try to create a teaching environment where someone has access to two things: a timeline, because almost everything you teach has some aspect of time, and academic documents. So how we interact with them individually and in combination could be hugely spectacular. Just the idea of being able to drag out 1970 as a thing. And then you can then choose, do you want to see everything related to the timeline on that, or document, or whatever it might be? The opportunities are endless. So if we go at it from a teaching rather than thinking, maybe that's useful. What does everyone think? But please, Bob first.
Well, I just wanted to say that that I and several other people have sort of routinely squished together time and visually maybe represented by some dates. I've never had a discussion with anybody else that does similar things, that people have objected to this, that people that viewers routinely accept that I represent 12,000 years plan with this much space, whereas on the same mural I represent 50 years with about the same amount of space. So people are happy to do that. At least do not object, and I will say, in general, make correct inferences from it. So that's another aspect of it.
It's a great point, Bob, and it leads further on the question that I'm asking the group, because imagine you have the timeline and you do some sort of a gesture and say, this slice, I want to pull it out, put it somewhere else. So you can then zoom in there, but they can be connected visually when you want to or not. So what's the general feeling of considering let's say for the demo, we maybe want to do in November, December, a teacher, but teaching to a live audience where they can ask questions and so on. Maybe
I love that idea. Well, so I mean, I'm not sure if anybody has actually used Timeline VR, but it has the ability to load multiple parallel timelines of Wikipedia articles. So in the video that I showed, it shows the internet and hypertext and Ted Nelson. I've also done, I was considering for that demo to show the timelines and cultural history of 20th century American handheld foods. So pizza and hot dogs and hamburgers, because they follow very similar patterns, where if you cross-reference those against things like the New Deal and various aspects of American political history, you start to see some interesting patterns of where demographics flow in and what that means for the sort of the cultural norms of what people consider to be everyday food. So Yeah, I'd love that. And one thing that when I wrote Timeline VR, we didn't have hand tracking, and so there wasn't the same level of nuance and manipulability. But I think that maybe I'm happy to do a rebuild from scratch. It's not that much work, but in terms of exploring and considering a case study, it may be fruitful to look at and think about how those articles, that data, can form a basis, and what sort of needs people sort of discover as they're thinking about manipulating it, and what else might be fruitful to try to visualize. Fabian saw, but it broke before I was able to get a capture of it. It was pretty macabre anyway. I got a map of the United States and turned it into a large sort of room scale 3D sort of thing that you could walk all the way across. And then I built these spiraling spires for the COVID cases in the early days of the pandemic. And so you could stand and look at what was happening to Washington, but then to see New York, you had to look all the way up because of how much higher it was at that time. The scales would need to be updated in order for it to have any meaningful information at all. But yeah, there are other things, numerical and quantitative data, that can be scraped and retrieved from Wikipedia as well, that can sort of form and constitute some pretty interesting stuff.
I was just going to say that I wasn't able to run it. I would absolutely love to be able to view it properly and to have a discussion around that. Adam?
I think the mural is interesting for me because it has many of the properties. It's hypertextual, or it feels like it will become hypertextual. It
Yes.
feels like many of them have a timeline aspect to it, or can have it. I'm really interested in argumentation maps, or mapping arguments, because I think it's really hard for people to grasp arguments, bigger arguments. Everyone has their own limits, but I think it's very useful to have that kind of information instead of linearized text. But also, I really find that if we're talking teaching, I found that things Brandel have done with the speaking voice and the hands, floating hands. I would really imagine that we could have Bob inside that mural, or someone inside that mural, close as a teacher, close to the board. But not, it could be a virtual teacher, so not having too much presence as a body hiding the board, but being a kind of a VR ghost doing demonstrations, hands and pointers. Often we use many things to highlight, laser pointers or big fonts or things, but having real hands doing gestures right in front of the information and talking through the information. Kind of like a museum guide where you have different stations depending on where, so not a linear thing through the whole thing by default, but more a thing where you could pick. It could be linear, but it would also be interesting to have it more as a museum guide there, where you could just go to a place and get a short guiding for that place with hands and voice and gestures and so on. So that's a teaching thing that is very, that ties together all the things, that the timeline and over.
Yeah. Has everybody seen Ken Perlin's Chalk Talk? And Barbara Tversky mentioned it in her speech. But it's a really interesting and valuable point of reference. He's a researcher, professor at New York University, and one of the things that he was playing with, one of the things he has in this video. So has anybody not seen it then, I guess?
I have.
Bob, are you familiar?
No.
Okay, so Perlin is he's a
I can't. I don't understand. And you talk so fast, I can't understand who you're talking about.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ken Perlin at
Perlin.
New York University. That's right. And I'll find the main talk is from 2017, and it's very what he does is draw, and similar to Ivan Sutherland's 62 demo or 63, it turns into meaningful marks. So if you draw a sort of an L, then that turns into the opportunity to plug that in as a time series. And then he draws something that looks like a pendulum. It turns into a pendulum. If he plugs that, if he sketches onto that, it turns into the sinusoidal graph of the pendulum moving. The only issue with it is that the domain of its applicability is limited by what gestures you sort of determine to be relevant for demonstration purposes. But as a longtime teacher, he knows what he wants to talk about, and I imagine you do too. And so thinking about what kinds of gestures give you the opportunity for this sort of latent palette of representations and modes, so that they can nevertheless remain sort of performed at the speed of conversation. We talk about working at the tool speed of thought, but performed at the speed of conversation is just as relevant from a pedagogical perspective. Then I think that would be a really interesting thing to sort of pursue. What do you tell people about this? What would you need to be able to do? I'm actually in a conversation. Somebody who's a fairly senior within virtual reality has started trying to put forward the idea of an XR for AR and VR guild, and the
what happened?
We lost him.
He's just being very thoughtful.
What's a secret guild? They took him.
Yes. Kill him. I don't know if you've seen that comment.
as a story.
Oh, he's back.
Oh, you're back.
Brandon, we lost you for a good deal after you told us about the guild.
It sounded like they took you out.
Yeah, the guild. The guild
Yes.
took you.
Sorry. So the guild is about is there to present principles, and one of the things that I've suggested for the website is for those principles to be rather than merely stated, to be performed, and I think that this is very much in line with that too.
So
I agree, and I would add in in most of them, or let's say many of the murals that I had contracts for from international organizations or governments, it was for decision making, not only for teaching. But yes, people walked around and gathered around it and did a lot of pointing and chattering to each other about the different aspects of the murals. They didn't stay.
Do you have recordings of that?
No, unfortunately, I do have none of those. Wish we had, but we could make some, in the future.
Yes, well, I think observation of the way it's actually used would be a really interesting method of investigation into what interactivity may add to those abilities to use it.
I made a mural, which I'll send to people next time, on the next 40 years of sustainability. And it was constructed for the CEOs of the top 200 companies in the world, called Vision 2050. It's on my website if you don't want to wait for me to send it. I asked the senior strategist of one of the companies in America, the Weyerhaeuser Forest Company, how did you use the mural? He says, it's in our boardroom. And I said, well, what do they do? I said, have you ever been there in it? And he says, yeah. He says, every so often in a meeting, in a discussion of the board, somebody will wave at the mural or point at the mural and say, yeah, but what about such and such? Because the mural was a set of something like 800, no, maybe I may be exaggerating here, 400 to 800 requirements for the next 40 years. And what was it? And I said, well, why is the mural in the boardroom? He says, we're a forest company. Our product takes 40 years to make. And so what's relevant in the context of the next 40 years and what may be required in terms of climate change and sustainability and energy and manufacturing and so forth was relevant to those people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really brilliant, Bob. Fabian? And
Yeah,
we have to finish soon, by the way, I'm afraid. At least I have to go soon.
Yeah, I have to go -4 minutes ago, so I'll be very, very quick. The first thing is honestly learning, teaching, to me, doesn't really matter as long as there is a goal. I'm very happy to help a learner, a teacher. Honestly, I feel they're about the same, or somebody who is in a company that have to optimize for SDGs or whatever. But as long as there is at least one person and they have at least one goal that is sufficiently explicit, then I feel I can help somehow. But if it's too generic, that's my challenge. But learning, teaching, having a presentation specific to that mural, that's all fine to me. And on a much more lower level, let's say, yes, Chalk Talk from Ken Perling is really amazing, but a word of warning, it is tightly coupled with that person. And that person is a brilliant programmer and teacher and a lot of other things, and extremely creative. So I tried to use it, and I'm not Ken Perling, and yeah, it didn't go well. So the potential is amazing, how it's combinatorial, recognizing gesture and all that, but I think it's very hard to reproduce for someone else, unfortunately. But the potential still is there, and the Adam example of you presenting with Brandon's tool and being able to even have the gesture and yet go back in time, because, for example, maybe that was a bit too quick for me. I think the potential is amazing.
I completely, I'm on board with that 100%. But also a little bit of context, we are competing with billion-dollar companies in this sense. So we should absolutely do it. But I think our magic sauce needs to be that we are not Apple, Google, or Meta. So we're not trying to own everything. I know I'm a bit repetitive here, but it's moved around through visual meta or other means. We should definitely not be stuck in one way. It's so important. I could imagine a teacher doing a thing in this environment, very much like described, but that is then actually in a normal textbook. And then it can go back into a completely different software renders environment and be able to produce something useful. But I think we're beginning to settle on a few things. We're doing wonderful demos and thinking. So unless anyone has something else, I look forward to Monday, where we're going to have Jad Esper present, which will be fun. That'll be our second monthly guest presentation. And also, I think we should up the speed and have one every 2 weeks rather than every 4 weeks, because there are just too many interesting people we have in the community. And the fact that the full transcript goes into our journal, hopefully will have value for them as well. See you all on Monday.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Have a relaxing weekend, everyone. Bye for now. Bye.
Hey, everybody.
Bye.